So this afternoon, I wanted to share some thoughts on the rise of the use of the term Judeo-Christian values, both in the US and in Europe, as a means of trying to define national identities. And increasingly, we're witnessing, I would argue, is the use of this term to sort of move away from multicultural societies in favor of a type of exclusionary nationalism, in particular as a way of excluding Muslims from Western culture. And by way of example, I wanted to start just this past month, President Trump oversaw the signing of a somewhat vague agreement between Serbia and Kosovo. And highlighting what he saw as the historic significance of this agreement, he presented it as an agreement between a Muslim country, Kosovo, and a European country, Serbia. And what's curious about this is that he labeled one country on a confessional basis, that is Kosovo as Muslim, and the other on a more geopolitical basis. In some ways, perhaps Trump was hearkening back to some ideas that the political scientist Samuel Huntington put forth back in the 1990s, and in which he divided the world into about 7 or 8 major civilizations, some ethnic, some religious, and then of course the West, and you can see them all here on this slide. What this rhetoric does, I would suggest, is to perpetuate the ideas that Muslims are not, or in the worst case reading, should not be part of the Christian West, an idea that's increasingly gaining strength in Europe and the American right. Now, there have long been debates over the nature of the identity of Europe and of the West and its founding legacy. And most today on the right and many on the left see the Enlightenment in its values of democracy, equality, tolerance, and individual freedom as a foundation for Western society. So while there are also problems, certainly, with the Enlightenment, in the wake of World War II, many intellectuals and politicians, wary of the anti-Semitic nature of just referring to Christian Europe, began using instead the term Judeo-Christian values, a term that actually was used in the US in the 1930s as a way of setting itself off from fascist Europe. But more recently, the historian James Loeffler has argued that this idea of a Judeo-Christian tradition has been one of America's greatest political inventions. While it was adopted on the left as a way of being inclusive, it was in fact quite exclusive. In fact, its origins trace back to the 19th century and was used to reference Jewish converts to Christianity, and thus furthered the notion of the superiority in some ways of Christianity. Jumping forward to today, in July, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo heralded the release of a State Department report on the global status of human rights. And Pompeo, like many others on the right, claim that, without much proof, that Christianity is under attack in the US and the West. The State Department's report, he argued, would, quote, return America's understanding of human rights back to the fundamental moorings of the Judeo-Christian tradition on which this country was founded. But that tradition, Loeffler argues, never really existed. Considering the long history of anti-Semitism in this country and in the West more broadly, it's a remarkable stance to suggest that the West has always embraced both Jewish and Christian values. In Europe, the notion of Judeo-Christian values has gained momentum in the past few years as a mean of halting the spread of what many on the far right see as the spread of Eurabia, some sort of Muslim invasion they see resulting from increased immigration from war zones in the Middle East. The idea that Europe is in decay and in spiritual decline as a result of abandoning its Christian heritage can be found in the writings of such disparate people as Pope Benedict and the self-proclaimed atheists, Niall Ferguson and Oriana Fallaci, as well as many other right-wing populists. Christianity for them is the bedrock of Western Europe and the bulwark against the spread of Islam. We can see this particularly well in the rise of right-wing populist groups that have been on the rise in Europe. In their 14-point position paper, for instance, the right-wing populist group Pegida in Germany, which stands for Patriotic Europeans Against the Islamization of the West, has explicitly stated that it is, quote, for the preservation and protection of our Judeo-Christian Western culture, end quote. The right-wing populist party, the Alternative for Germany, which actually has seats in all 16 of the German federal states, has in their 2017 platform, quote, pledged its unconditional support to the freedoms of faith, worship, and conscience, end quote. But then they state that they are opposed to Islamic practices, whatever that may be, that are directed against the Judeo-Christian and humanist foundations of our culture. Now, many scholars and critics, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim, reject this line of thinking as once again being exclusionary and anti-Islam, as it overlooks the long history of interfaith relations and the contributions that Islam has made to Western culture. Tariq Ramadan, for instance, a respected but controversial scholar of Islam, has argued, as you can see from this quote, that Europe has to reconcile itself with the diversity of its past in order to master the imperative pluralism of the future. And Islam was part of that past. Even Christopher Caldwell, one of the leading scholars warning against the so-called Islamic colonization of Europe, has recognized the indebtedness of Europe to Islam and Islamic scholars. And you can see a quote here from one of his books. What secular Europeans call Islam is a set of values that Dante and Erasmus would recognize as theirs. But on the other hand, the modern secular rights that now constitute core European values, he argued, would leave both Dante and Erasmus somewhat bewildered. Now, there's a lot that could be said about the similarities and compatibility between Islam and the West, but to do so, I think, would in many ways only justify the question to begin with. And these categories themselves, I would argue, consider the fact that Ilhan Omar, a devout Muslim and congresswoman from Minnesota, is a pro-LGBTQ, pro-choice feminist, whereas Amy Coney Barrett, on the other hand, the most recent appointment to the US Supreme Court, is a devout Catholic, is not in favor of LGBTQ rights, is not pro-choice, and is certainly not a feminist. So in closing, I'd like to suggest that this appeal to Judeo-Christian values as a foundation of Western culture is really an argument that pushes a socio-political agenda and is in fact designed to ostracize Muslims and others by arguing that they somehow aren't compatible with Western values. I would in fact argue that the true legacy of the Enlightenment is a guarantee of individual freedom and religious tolerance. Denying this freedom and being intolerant of other religions is then a betrayal of the actual foundations of Western.